We are about to begin our first panel for today. This panel will be discussing cities of today and talents of tomorrow. Please allow me to welcome our moderator, who needs absolutely no introduction, Miss Arwa Damon. She is the senior international correspondent for CNN, who we all know, love, and respect for your beautiful journalism. Thank you for being with us, Arwa. I would like to start by introducing our panelists. Mr. Wael Awar. Wael founded IBDA Design in 2009. He has extensive experience in designing and managing projects ranging from university campuses to private villas and mosques. He has a multidisciplinary approach to design, addressing the social, environmental, economical, and technological aspects of each project. Welcome, Mr. Wael. Mr. Emile Haddad, Chairman and Executive Officer of 5 Point Holdings, the largest developer of mixed-use communities in coastal California. Emile is mostly known as a builder of communities and sports facilities. He has analyzed in depth why cities become great and has applied those principles to communities created, developed by his company. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Romy Hawatt. Romy is a leading entrepreneur, best known for cultivating innovation, transforming startups and fledgling businesses into successful multi-million-dollar commercial projects. His focus is on education and training as a pathway to a sustainable future and the preservation of human dignity by ending human trafficking and modern-day slavery. Our next panelist, Mr. Khaled Janahi. With over 30 years of diverse experience in banking and financial services, Mr. Janahi is the chairman of Vision 3 and served as group executive at Dar al-Amal al-Islami Trust in Switzerland. Prior to that, Khaled was a partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers and served on a number of other boards, including the Arab Business Council, World Economic Forum, the Center for International Business and Management, and the University of Cambridge. He is currently focused on venture capital, specifically on startups. Ahla wa sahla. Last but most certainly not least, Mrs. Melek al-Nimer. Melek was born in Istanbul and resided in Lebanon since 1981. She has been working with and for marginalized communities for the past 25 years, dedicating her life to improve the conditions of Palestinians living in refugee camps in Lebanon. She founded the Social Support Society to serve the needs of elderly people in 2010, established a Unite Lebanon Youth Project, an NGO that banks on the power of learning at the best investment to provide hope and create change. Welcome. Ahla wa sahla fikum, and the panel is about to begin.
Thank you very much. Well, we have quite the meeting of minds here today, to say the least, so I'm going to jump straight into it. When we talk about this concept of sustainable development, it seems like quite the caption buzzword these days, but Romy, exactly what does that mean?
It can mean many things and varies over time as technology and the like advances and the needs of society changes. But in short, it's balancing the social, economic and environmental needs of current generations against those projected needs of future generations, in order that what we do today has a profound effect on what happens in the future, tomorrow. So everything we need to do today must be sustainable, with one eye in the present and the other eye into the future.
But that's obviously, I mean, a formula that, you know, is very different depending on where it is that you're building. You know, your projects are in the modern world. They're in the first world. We want to take those kinds of projects and those kinds of concepts and apply them to either underdeveloped countries or countries who are at war and need massive reconstruction projects. How is that actually feasible? Is it possible? And how does it play out?
Well, survival takes precedent over luxury. And you know, the cascade of needs always takes precedent. The need for food, shelter, and the like. healthcare and the like. So we start off with the fundamentals that society requires, and then we move forward from there. And I think the more advanced, wealthier societies have an obligation to help nurture along and support those emerging societies that are kind of moving from the realms of survival into sustained development as urban societies.
And in your experience, how would you translate that?
Well, your question assumes that we don't have the same issues in the modern world. All you have to do is turn on CNN and you see that in the United States we have very similar issues in terms of segregation, in terms of non-inclusiveness and all of the above. So I actually think that the way, at least I look at the solution, is by mixing everything. I think that the societies that have actually sustained are the societies that were very much inclusive and actually mixed everything, all the way from people who come from different corners of the world, people who have means and people who don't have means. When you put people together, there's something magical that happens because people start getting to know each other. And I think part of the problem we have today in the world is that people don't know enough about each other. And the more you can put them together, the more there's going to be compassion. And I think that becomes the cornerstone of a sustainable society.
But what, you and I were talking about this morning, is you can create these open spaces, you can create these communal spaces where, in theory, people from all walks of life can actually have access to. But then how do you inspire or at least propel individuals towards having a conversation with someone who they may not necessarily be comfortable with?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's important is not only creating these beautiful open park spaces, but having these people actively interacting within these spaces. And I think programming and activities, having activities within these spaces or certain arts that people gather around in order to start a dialogue or a conversation is something that's very important. And of course, other certain entities can create these kind of theaters within public spaces that also people can watch and start to dialogue or talk about what's happening.
May I add to what Wael said? I was introduced as somebody who builds sports facilities and entertainment, and people ask me why. And I always say that when you have two parents sitting, they don't know each other, watching their kids play, and one of them scores a goal, the high five at an emotional moment might start a relationship that might change both lives. The same thing with amphitheaters. We build amphitheaters. Two people reciting the words of a favorite song. And it doesn't matter whether they're rich or not. There's something emotional about that moment that changes people's lives. And I think that's what Wael was saying, and I totally agree with it.
Melek, you have a lot of experience dealing with marginalized communities in Lebanon, dealing with the refugee community, and you've seen some of these concepts to a certain degree being implemented on the ground. I mean, what is the reality on the ground when we're talking about trying to bring in entire communities that have been on the fringe into a more inclusive society?
I believe that urban planning will not turn around what does not exist in people's hearts and souls. It cannot create peace. What it can do is create physical and psychological spaces where it can contribute to coexistence. But what we need is policy making, policy change aimed at alleviating the root causes. What we need to do is address not only urban inequalities, but individual and group-based historic grievances, people of being marginalized, discrimination, disempowerment. In my opinion, we should take the conversation back to that before we get to urban spaces that will promote coexistence.
Khaled, you wrote a few years ago, which I found online, but you basically said that the way that, a lot of big developers, governments kind of view development, that they have the wrong formula. You said that, the formula that they tend to use is, you need to first bring about security, then stability, and then that's going to bring about a sustainable society, but that's wrong. The actual way to go about it is entirely the opposite.
That's correct. I want to share something with you. Like most of the people who know him, Ricardo Karam, when he gives you a call, says, I want you to do something, it's very difficult to say no. So, talabatu awamir. So when he said, I want you to be in a session, I said yes, without knowing which session I'm going to be in. And then when I knew, I called him, I said, I don't know anything about this subject. I said, I want you there as a disruptor. I feel as the destructor in this session, actually. But let me just come back to your point. I think we've been, and this is a city, thank you, Paula, for hosting us here. It's a lovely city. I think it's one of the few cities in the Arab world that I can speak my mind and get away with it. Most of the other cities in the Arab world, I get red lines flashing in front of me before I speak. We've been brought up in this part of the world with, actually, when that piece was very much about the MENA, about our part of the world. And we've been brought up in this part of the world that security, throughout our life, that security is the most important thing. That will make the place stable, then we're going to have real economic and sustainable development. And it's just been hashing into our head throughout our bringing up. I mean, when Kailash was talking about the mindset shift, when he was talking about the revolution aspect of the mindset shift, I think that is the missing point. I think we've been kept, as Shamma has been used, whether it was the Palestinian issue, whether it was then this miserable sectarian issue or whatever. Every time we've had some sort of a Shamma coming at us and getting our minds off and basically spending all the resources in the security. And unfortunately, it's been the wrong thing done by the regimes in the Arab world. And the problem is that the people have accepted this. So I think the way I always look at it is that sustainability means the following. Number one, that the individuals, they are brought up with a clear perspective that it's a merit-based society. It's a merit-based society in terms of every aspect. So everybody, the good, they arrive. I'm not being Darwinian here, saying al-baqa'u al-aslah. Innama, I'm saying the merit brings you forward. Look around you in the Arab world. How many in the regimes have come with merit? You'll see very, very few. Actually, don't just look at the regimes. Look at the businesses. How many of the people who get to the businesses with real merit perspective? So meritocracy is a concept which is totally missed. Critical thinking, which is part and parcel of that. I think we cannot talk about bringing up and really creating a sustainable society without critical thinking. Critical thinking has to be embedded in all of us. I believe, and it is a reality, that we should do it, and just to look at the best. I mean, everybody actually, when you read in The Economist and some other magazines, they're saying this part of the world is irrelevant. And I must admit, I feel as an Arab ashamed, but I have to accept that we are totally irrelevant to the rest of the world. We don't add anything today to the world from perspective of just look at technology, just look at everything else. We have, even if we add it when we are outside rather than inside. From an inside perspective, we have little to give to the rest of the world. So I think critical thinking is a very, very important factor as a pillar of sustainability. Education, which of course this follows the education side, we don't have the wrong education. Education, we can go to Harvard, we can do whatever. When we come back here, the world is totally different. We don't have that openness, we don't have that perspective to really develop. This young man, okay, because he's younger than I am, because he left a few years after I left Lebanon, okay, he would not have been as successful as he is if he was in this part of the world. Okay? So perspective in terms of that when we look to different places, it means different things. So we need to create truly the stability in our part of the world. I think so-called Arab Spring, the main reason the Arab Spring was not successful, not because it was a leaderless movement, which is an important point. It was a leaderless movement, and the reason it was a leaderless movement because we did not have the sustainable mindset shift by moving out, by thinking outside the box, creating leaders. We lack leaders in the Arab world, whether we like it or not. We have so many. In every avenues of life, we have rulers, we don't have leaders. Everybody basically tells you what to do and what is in his mind. When I say everybody, I don't mean 100%, but most of us, when what we have in our mind is what moves for everyone, rather than really trying to bring everybody together and being part of all. So I heard last night, somebody said, I think one of the laureates last night said something important. He talked about the Alexander Dumas, the Three Musketeers. All for one and one for all. We are in part of the world, actually. It's all for one. One is never for all. So that is an element that we need to share.
Let's change the conversation towards what do we actually do? to try to reverse this? We're talking about sustainable development. We're talking about education. We're talking about the need to create more of a balance between the different stratus of society. How do you go about actually doing that instead of just talking about it?
Societies are based around control. Everything governments do and society does is around corralling and herding people into a particular pipeline of control. And in order to attain that control, first you must frighten them and then offer them up security, to your point. I think, in a sense, was it Julius Caesar that said, please forgive me if I'm quoting wrong, he said, if you want people to give up their rights, first you must frighten them and then offer them security or a solution, and they will gladly give up their rights to you. And I think this still applies to this very, very day. I think in many ways we need to devolve. We're in this rush to modernize. I mean, we have cities and societies that are completely reliant on a system. And if you break that down, it comes down to a very small handful of control mechanisms and levers that are controlling all of us. We need to devolve. And I kind of think when we're talking about urban society, I think what we need to reintroduce is some kind of rural thinking into urban society and bring us back to nature and back to what really we have a deep and meaningful natural affiliation with. I think we've lost the plot in many ways.
I don't think we need to do anything. I think it's going to happen on its own. I think that we're living in times right now that are disruptive in every way. As much as we might look at the social media today as something that is more about gossip, I think the social media is going to allow conversations to take place that governments are not going to be able to stop. And we're not going to be able to box people in silos. A lot of what you're seeing today happen in the Middle East in terms of reform is driven by that. It's driven by the fact that we can't stop people from knowing what happens somewhere else in the world. We cannot today look at people and say, you're going to be kept in the dark and we'll tell you what's happening. I think it's going to happen. And I think that the more we try to force things, the more we're going to realize that we're going to get frustrated. I think it's going to happen on its own.
Sure, but given, as you're saying, obviously, how in turmoil the world is and how we're all trying to kind of navigate these various different factors that impact our lives, such as social media, to assume that humanity will actually move in the correct direction is a big assumption. And is there not a burden of responsibility on individuals who have perhaps the luxury of being able to be a part of this conference to help open up different platforms, to help open up different conversations, to help fight against this isolationist mentality that we have? Because yes, we're a more connected society, and yet I believe we are more fundamentally distant than one another than we have ever actually been.
I think that we're in a period of disruption. I think this is probably the third period of disruption in man's history. And it's all driven by what we ended up today labeling as the digital revolution. Everything is being disrupted. Everything that we knew, we grew up with, is going to be obsolete within the next 20 to 30 years. Last time we saw something like this was over 100 years. So it might look like when you're in the middle of it, it's as if you are in white water rafting and it's very turbulent. But beyond that, there's going to be a point where stability will find its way. We saw that before. And I think we are living in the third revolution right now. And
Except society has become completely desensitized to what's real and what's not real. You can live in your ivory tower. You can live in New York in the highest, most plush penthouse. And that is a symbol of success. But turn off the electricity. And then what happens? No flushing toilets. You've got to walk down 100 flights of stairs to pick up a couple of liters of water. And, no one is thinking about the fact that we are all corralled into this control mechanism. We need to move away and become more independent as human beings. I love the saying, he who is first will become last, and he who's last will become first, in a flip of a coin. And I think, if you really put the acid on it, it'll be the indigenous societies that haven't lost touch with the earth and how to grow and find food that will survive. We, living in this modern world, will perish. You'll be killing each other for what's in your neighbor's fridge within a few days. I mean, that's how ridiculous it's become.
To bring the conversation, how then keeping all of this in mind, do we build our societies?
I think, you know, there's certain ways to look at this, but what's important is that, you know, when we come to build our societies, we also look back at history and learn from that and try to understand from what has been done and how do we move forward. And as an architect, you know, the last time that there was a huge, massive destruction, World War II, and then the redevelopment or rebuilding of Europe or even other cities, you know, the modern age took over. And we've seen where the modern age has taken us. I mean, modernity, the modern architecture, which is very present in Kuwait also during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was an architecture purely driven by Excel sheets, prefabricated structures, the need to build quick, and the need to build just to house people very quickly into them. And what we lost culture and we lost context in terms of the modern architecture methodology. And these are two very important points that I think we have to keep and reflect when we come to build a sustainable development is culture and context. And this is something very inherent in the Arab world. You know, Khaled touched upon Emile being very successful because he left the Arab world, but I mean, true and untrue. I mean, you know, success is not measured only by wealth, but success is measured by other great, you know, achievements that we still have in the Arab world, which is our culture. We have a very strong culture. We have a very strong identity that we need to keep in order, you know, that will allow us to sustain and move forward.
I think fourth industrial revolution that Emile is talking about, it's there, it's a disruptor, it's going to be an ongoing, things will change. What we did 10 years ago, okay, changed actually 100 times more than 50 years ago, is going to change 1,000 times more in the next 5, 6 years ago. That's a given. So that is part of what's happening in front of us. But the world is changing too. We were a single polar world, today we're a multipolar world. I think what you were getting at about the changes happening around you, I think we have to live that. So everybody's becoming more looking inwards rather than looking outwards. A lot of things which have happened lately, you're a journalist, you're in Turkey, you've seen that. It would not have happened, actually. I believe it would not have happened if we were still a single polar, if Mr. Trump was more of a inclusive than anything else. So I think the word, and it's a word, it's an English word, but it's, I think, deglobalization is upon us. That's one of the biggest disruptors that we're going to have in front of us now. But we have to go through that. We have to know that that's going to happen, and we have to manage that. I think the issue of culture is an important point. Okay. However, culture without actually a mindset shift. I think we need a real mindset shift in this part of the world. We need a revolution of the mindset shift to do anything to create sustainability. So it's not an easy thing. I mean, we live in a part of the world where majority of us, we walk with our backs against the wall. So anyone who walks with his back against the wall means he's not going to give anything except whatever the guy at the top says. He says, Naam Sidi, even if he's wrong. We are so many of us, we are so scared for our own positions, I'm talking about the people who are so-called elites in the Arab world. We're so scared that we lose our elitism by saying, hey, no, sir, this is wrong. You got to do it the right way. A lot of us, we don't. And that is a problem. So that actually, if you don't change that, I don't think you're going to start going. That's why we are today. Let me just give you an example. I'm being an Arab now, I'm going back. Give you an example. Tokyo and Berlin, okay? Cities of the past, look at them today. They went through a war, they were totally destructive. Look where they went immediately after the war. Just look at the Arab world. I lived in Lebanon. I lived in Beirut during the good years. I left, I still go back to Beirut. Ricardo knows this. Every time I go, I cry because what I had when I was there, I will never see it again. And I think to myself, why not? I mean, it's happened in Tokyo, it's happened in Berlin. Something must be wrong. I see cities, they built Dubai. Dubai is such a beautiful city, okay? However, what's there? Apart from that beauty, is modernity building beautiful houses, beautiful buildings, beautiful cities? It's much more than building cities. It's much, much more than that.
And, you know, sustainability is not necessarily modernity. I mean, To a certain degree, and I completely agree, we need to change the way we think about each other and the way that we interact with one another. And to that effect, Melek, with your work with the refugee population in Lebanon, you've actually seen yourself firsthand the challenges that they face and also the consequences of what happens when, because let's face it, a lot of the countries in the Middle East right now have massive refugee populations who, again, reality, are not going to be able to go back home. So what happens when we're trying to rebuild these fabrics of society and we actually exclude a huge part of the population, whether or not they're refugees or marginalized members of society?
Exactly. It's very good to be talking about critical thinking. Of course, everyone should be educated enough to get to the point where they have to realize that you need to think critically, right? But you first have to get people to school. There's a whole segment of the population that has no access to education. There's no social security. They don't have access to the labor market. They don't have access to the housing market. So they don't have the mindset to even think that they have rights anymore. They don't think that they have the right to ask for their rights. So I think that needs to be remedied before we start talking about which way the world is going. You can't leave those people behind. Then you'll have another Dubai, It's
Where do you start, practically speaking? From a social, you're building society, you're physically building, you're building society, and you also have to build trust between communities in a lot of the countries.
Yeah, I think
you have to be inclusive.
I think the starting point is that we need, talking about, TAK minds, I think we need to reset the way that we view the world and our psychology altogether. Remembering, by virtue of the fact that we're all sitting here in this room, we live in the top 3% of every human being on the planet. 97% of the people on the planet don't live like we live. They don't wear the same clothes that we wear. They don't eat and drink the same food. They're not transported the same way we get around. So let's not kind of just live in our own little bubble here. Let's think about the world at large and what that means across the planet, because the challenges and the needs and the aspirations of the majority of people are very different to the people sitting in this room. But we have a responsibility to make sure that we mindfully accommodate those needs as we move forward and build new societies, new cities, new urban environments. With the refugees, I come from Australia, Lebanese descent, but born in Australia for many generations now. We have a vast country full of land and resources. If I think of what people, given the opportunity, could actually create in that environment, is just astounding if they were given that opportunity. But we have governments that kind of put the barriers up to stop these people reaching their self-determination, getting the education that they need, pulling down those barriers to allow them that opportunity to exist.
And so given that governments have and will historically continue to fail populations, because let's just face it, that's the reality of the world we live in, where is the burden on us to then try to actually do something to change that in whatever small way that we can?
I think it's very important that, that each one plays his individual role in contributing as much as he can contribute in trying to help with this mindset of critical thinking, in engaging with discussions with other people and trying to bridge the gap that's currently existing between, our societies. And it's all about the stereotype image, or the fear of the other, or also the idea of feeling threatened always, in a way that you need to defend yourself in order to exist. And it's all through actual education. Education is key. Without education, you won't have the ability to think and to be exposed to differences. And it's not about education within a certain framework. You can build a school within an isolated community, but that school will only teach you what that isolated community knows. And it's more about building schools or on a public scale, where people from different backgrounds, people with different ways of thinking can indulge and engage. And that's very difficult.
Talk refugees. Let's differentiate between the natural disaster refugees and the displaced refugees by force through wars and everything else. So let's talk about the second one. I think the second one, we as people, talking about as people, and I'm purely the Arab world, just give you an example. Today's example. How many actually in the Arab world, the masses, stand up and shout about what's going on in Yemen? How many? I think you're 3% that you're talking from the Arab world, they don't stand up and shout. For a lot of reasons. One is because, as I said, their backs against the wall, they are scared of what their governments think or don't think, from perspective supporting or not supporting. But reality is people have been killed, people have been displaced, and everything is happening there. So we talk about fixing. Fixing is one thing. Fixing is a one-off thing. But there's no point to fix if you don't really do what I would call al-asas, if you don't go down and clean up and do something forward. Even the leaders in the Arab world, if they don't see their people standing up and telling them this is wrong, they will carry on doing what they're doing, not because of anything, because they believe it's right. Whether it's right or wrong, they believe it's right, because their masses believe it. Even when I go to the United States, they always say, you, the Arabs, and because of there's a policy in the Arab world somewhere, I tell them, wait a second. If I talk to you as Americans, say you have, unfortunately, you as an individual, you, Emile, you brought this Trump for us because you voted one way or the other, but you got him in. I have no right, I have no say. So it's the decision of a regime, it's nothing to do with me. So even that aspect, we are scared, we're shy of talking about it, but that's reality. So why not face the reality? So let's fix it. There is a fixing issue of the refugees, we have to fix it now. Education is important, housing is important, everything else is important, but there is no point to build Dubais for them or build beautiful houses for them if we do not give them the basic aspect of really seeing that there is a future, they have a merit like everybody else. If they work hard, they can get through. If they don't, they don't get through. Everybody is on equal footing. There is no point. We're all being believers or non-believers, God says we are all here equal. So let's be equal and let's fight and let's be better. Let's improve. Let's compete.
This is what you advocate for, though. But at the end of the day, how do we take this from being a conversation here today into something that is actually real and tangible?
Everything in the Middle East somehow turns to politics. They love their politics in this part of the world. So no matter what you're talking about, urban societies and sustainable development becomes political. You know, we talk about democracy as being a solution, but, you know, they talk about democracy like you can fill jars up with it. I mean, what is democracy? Lobbying groups that have a particular lean or an influence on a government that put them in power and they get their way to the disadvantage of the masses. You know, I think Margaret Thatcher said, you know, politicians are like nappies. They should be changed frequently and for the same reasons. You know, because they soil them very, very badly, therefore need to be changed regularly in terms of keeping in time with what society really requires, etc. But I think, you know, to keep back to the key issue, I mean, we live in a society, in a world, in our 3% at least, where we're bringing up children that have never even put their hands in the soil. Now, you think, well, you know, it's a simple thing. How many of your kids have planted a tree? Many trees. Probably very few. I mean, forget the psychological and the physiological reasons. You know, by putting your hands in the soil, you get micro-cuts, microbacteria is added to the system. Your immune system has a chance to deal with those multiple changes in these threats, these immune threats. And you build a stronger child, you know, we're desensitizing our children, we're insulating our children, we're encapsulating their thinking to within very limited parameters and steering them and funneling them in a certain way that is not going to be conducive to sustainable societies going forward. We need to look at these things holistically, and we need to start from ground zero, literally from birth, with the new generation, because that's where our hope and future actually lies, and start to educate that process.
I think it's important to disconnect democracy, which is far, far, far away from us here, to basically giving everybody equal rights to come through. I think to create sustainability, you need to give equal rights. The hell with democracy. Democracy is a later thing. I think what has been put forward, I fully agree. However, I will look at it top down. So the richest person in the country has to do that with his children before the poorest person does in his country. I think that's the way it's, so we cannot just ask for the masses to do it whilst the guys at the top sitting and enjoying the wealth, which, by the way, they didn't get it by right. Majority of us, we don't get it by right. Since I'm one of the 3%, I get a lot of money coming to me, and when I look at it, I say, fine, what have I done to earn this money? But I think that is an important point to forget the democracy factor. I think I would like to see people basically being given the same equal opportunities across the Arab world and abroad, everywhere else in the world, because that's the way we're going to create a society which is sustainable, goes forward, and we have security for each other.
And so given, what this panel is meant to be focused on, which is, development and sustainable development, is then creating space for people, the haves and the have-nots, to come together sufficient, or do we actually need to somehow refocus the way that we're approaching all of this? Because you can create space, but you can't force people to interact, and you can't force respect if an individual doesn't want to respect the other.
Well, look, I left this part of the world 33 years ago, so I'm not entitled to engage in the same discussion about political barriers, which unfortunately 33 years later, they're still as high, if not higher, than when I left. But I build in a place that doesn't have as high of political barriers, but we deal with a lot of social barriers that are very similar. We build in one of the most expensive regions in the world that's only available for the elite, as was said. And what we do, and I'm just a hummingbird with one drop in my beak, but what we try to do is build places that become a proof of concept. Because if you can actually show that it could be done in San Francisco or in LA, at least the social barriers could be broken down. So today, when you're building places like we're building cities, where people who don't belong to 3%, they belong to the 0.0003% of the world can afford them, yet they're going to be neighbors, and they are neighbors today, to people who meet the very low income. We're building public schools, donating them to the public system, and putting the kids of those who don't have any means next to those who do. You know what? Not only are they getting the education, but they're starting to realize that I'm your equal. And they're starting to realize that the definition of person is not by what you own, but actually by what you do and how you live your life. And that's how you start changing the world. You're starting changing the world by taking insecurities away from those who are unfortunately underprivileged. You put them next to people and show them that they're not any different. And then they start standing up. And maybe one day, they will stand up to people who are governing them and having their back to the world and say, you know what? I think I can.
What happens if we fail? The 3%, people who are here, the thinkers, the people that can actually, at this level, bring about change? Because we're all having a great discussion here, but what happens if we fail to turn words into action?
I think if we fail, we try again. And we fail, we try again. And we keep on having the courage to keep on trying. Because someone once said, what would you do if you knew you could not fail? And that's what you do. You keep on trying. Because at the end of the day, if you're on the right side of the equation, you will succeed.
Melek, you look like you want to say
we've already
something.
failed. That's why we're in this mess. That's why we're having this discussion.
I don't accept that.
No, I think actually American exceptionalism is very, very important here. I think one thing you learn in the United States, which is good, is that they celebrate failures before they celebrate successes. Okay?
Well, yeah, because in theory, you're supposed to learn from your failures, but...
I'm all with Emile, that we should celebrate failures before we celebrate successes. However, now I'm going to bring it back, not to politics, to human beings. I think if we fail, if we carry on failing here, I think the next Arab Spring damn thing is going to come into this part of the world is going to be so bloody that the people have just had enough from everything. Nothing will stop them. Sectarianism, excuse will not stop them. This Muslim business is not going to stop them. Palestinian issue is not going to stop them. They will do it, and they will do it very, very hard next time around. So I think that is the big thing that we have to wait and see if we're going to see it. During my lifetime, I don't think so. But it's going to happen if we're going to carry on giving excuses to ourselves to fail and fail and fail again by not allowing the people and the masses to come up and just putting them down. I think that is going to be a major, major problem. But I'm fully with the American exceptionalism. I am very much for it. Celebrate failures before celebrate successes. In business, that's number one thing that we should do, but we don't do it. But when it comes to people, failure, eventual failure, is going to be a major, major disaster for this part of the world.
So there's always been inequity in the world. There's inequity from the past, there's inequity in the present, and there's going to be inequity. You know, for in this world, there will always be greater and lesser persons than yourself, as the saying goes. And so we need to balance that off about what is morally correct, you know, socially, economically, and environmentally correct and sustainable. If we get back to the point of sustainability. And I think people that are given at least the basics are so happy with what they have. They're not preoccupied with, you know, the negative things that cause death and destruction. I think, you know, there needs to be equity, and there needs to be a rebalancing in order to provide those people that are displaced, that are not heard, that don't have a voice, that are being exploited, that opportunity to simply live. You know, we are disenfranchising them, compartmentalizing them, you know, directing them in a way where they aren't heard. They don't have that voice. We need to create a platform, urban living, new societies, government, you know, government policies and the like, all need to be focused around these issues. And the problem will fix itself if you give them that platform.
Can I bring it back to the beginning? Sustainability.
Oh, I thought you were going to say politics for a
this
second.
point. No, with this point. Sustainability, and with a very important point just made. I think eventually, if we're going to have sustainability, if people, you're right, equity and inequity has been there all the time. But I tell you, it's not the issue of the guy at the top who's not allowing equity. If you as an individual allow inequity to carry on, disaster is going to be upon you. So the issue is not, we're always scared of talking about the guys at the top. Reality is not the guys at the top, it's the guys at the bottom, the masses, and the most of the 3% who allow this thing to carry on. So we need to basically come out. The Arab world, I'll bring it back to the Arab world, today is in a much worse situation than it was, because before we had most of Asia, we had most of Latin America, the same as us. We were all basically autocratic in one way or the other. We were all the same. Today, the only part of that, even sub-Saharan Africa, is going forward. We are only part of the world that we are carrying on with that same mindset of inequity and equity business that carries on the same, and giving the same excuses day in, day out, year in, year out. That has got to stop, and it's got to stop by the people. It's not to be stopped from the top. And it's not going to be stopped by United Nations, it's not going to be stopped by anybody else. So it's got to be stopped by the people and people themselves.
It's self-determination that's a key here, because, you know, governments can't sustain societies by giving handouts the whole time.
No, they can't. You have to empower the individual and give them dignity.
It's self-determination. You need to empower the individual, give them the platform to work off, and let them go.
But
let
again,
the human spirit
these
run.
words that we keep using, empowering the individual, giving them the platform, creating these safe spaces, communal spaces, I mean, they're words, they're concepts, they're ideals. When you bring it back down to reality on the ground, when you're talking about, you know, an individual, a refugee who is from, you know, be it Lebanon or Palestine or Syria or Iraq, who has literally lost everything. I mean, Melek, you know this. What does these concepts, what do they actually mean for these people, and how do you do something about it?
Nothing. I mean, you need policy change. I mean, what's the only way? You have to educate these people, right? Once you have provided the basic services, which they don't have. Next step is education. Then you get to everything else that we've been talking about. But for that, you need policy change.
But at the same
Sorry?
time, I mean, you know, back to politics, but at the same time, we live in a world that, as I was saying before, and as we know too well, you know, political leaders will fail. That does not give us the excuse to fail. So what do we actually do about it? How do we change?
You do what I do.
Well, I think last night, Ricardo in his speech spoke about the Yazidi young lady who is now a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I think we always are basically going on a catch-up basis rather than going forward. We basically, whenever, now, just give you an example. If something gone wrong, if everybody at the top says, right, now we should support this because there is pressure and everything else, and everybody, the mass starts doing it. The mass should be helping. When we talk about refugees, I do not see any reason. I live in Switzerland. I see the way the Syrian refugees, how they are basically treated, the opportunities they've been given, and I feel sad. Good in a way, I'm happy for them, but I feel sad that it does not happen in my part of the world the same way as it happens in that part of the world. I mean, it's not just a question of giving them a job, it's a question of the respect. The question is that if they are good for a job, they compete with somebody else and they get the job because they are better than the other person, rather than they are because just refugees. So they've given the opportunity, talking about giving them the platform, they use the platform to go forward. In this part of the world, we do not see that. It's very, very difficult to see that happening. Talking about policy changes, you cannot change policies just like that. We have the best laws in the world in this part of the world. I'm talking about the GCC. We have the best part of laws in the world. But when you have people above the law, I'm sorry to say, the law is not good enough. And we have people above the law. And that is a problem that you have. Of course, this is the best country out of them all, Kuwait, and that's why I can talk, because there are a limited number of people above the law, but when you go, there are so many people above the law. So the law, the rule of the law, goes out to the door. As a businessman, you come and do business, the first question you raise is, where is the rule of the law? If the rule of the law is number one, how many people, just look at Dubai and Abu Dhabi and everything, how many billionaires have been made in the past 20 years? So many billionaires have been made. Really go deep down. How do they make the money? You see, coming back, giving resources. When you own the land, the sea, and the sky, and everything in between, you own it, and everybody has to accept that you own it. It's a problem for the people there to do anything with it. So you have, the first point is for the mass, it's not political. The first thing for the mass say, no, you don't own it. You have the privilege of saying and managing it, but you don't own it. And that is the problem that I think, if we don't accept it, if we don't face the mirror and say this is a reality, we all know. Majority of us here know that's a reality. But majority of us here are scared of saying it.
But having rule of law does not necessarily automatically guarantee equality or respect for the individual.
Of course it doesn't.
You need to, in and of yourself, be brought up as a decent human being that actually has a measure of moral courage.
Power corrupts, and they say absolute power corrupts absolutely. You know, what we have, if you have a centralized system, you are going to get corruption in that system, and it's not going to allow these moral norms and things to flow down, what should be a moral norm to flow down. What we're seeing, though, is in many ways a fight against the decentralization of power. The United Nations has 17 sustainability goals. Every country in the world is a signatory to those goals. I happen to be a founding member of the Global Sustainability Network, and we are pursuing Goal 8, and in particular 8.7, which is ending modern-day slavery and human trafficking. Kailash, who spoke earlier, is one of our notable members of the Global Sustainability Network. And it comes back down to that human dignity and, you know, me not exploiting another human being for my personal gain, no matter what level of the supply chain that happens to be. It's incumbent upon me to understand, you know, where my buttons are made. You know, not me lavishing in luxury at the disadvantage of some poor human being, a child or whoever in a factory somewhere in Bangladesh or in Africa somewhere. You know, we have a global responsibility, and the United Nations has taken a decentralizing role in having everyone sign up to this, and is auditing the progress. By the year 2030, these goals, everyone has signed on to meet. And they cover all aspects, the ocean, the environment, you know, human dignity, employment. There's all sorts of things that are covered in this particular area. And I think that's one of the promises that we have, or hopes that we have for the future. And I think governments need to know, and I think they do know, that they're being watched, increasingly being watched by third parties on their progress towards this area of sustainability.
So is it then a bit premature to be having a conversation about, you know, the role that urban development can necessarily play in terms of peace building, or?
I think maybe the title is wrong. When we talk about urban development, this is a discussion that goes beyond urban development. And look, I think that we have to be a little bit careful about giving our youth an excuse by telling them that they're not going to be able to do anything because they're suppressed by governments. I can tell you, I moved to the United States of America with nothing. Nothing. And I have people over there who've lived all their lives. But they were told that because of the color of their skin or whatever, that they're not going to be able to make it. They had every advantage over me, every advantage. I didn't know the system, I didn't know anything, and I didn't have money. But I had hunger, and I had fear, and I needed to survive, and I need to make sure that people I love are taken care of. So I wasn't biased. I didn't have this artificial ceiling that was put on top of me that says you will never be able to break through it. So I would just say that as much as I heard the same discussion from my grandmother, my parents, and myself until I left. But please don't tell our youth that they cannot, because until we have policy change, they're going to live in desperation. I think I just careful about that.
No, I like to correct what you said. You see, I think you used, the words are important here. I'm telling the youth of today in the Arab world, actually, I'm not saying don't do anything because you're suppressed. No, I'm telling the youth, stand up and don't be suppressed. That's what I'm telling the youth, and do things. That is what I'm telling the youth. If I'm going to tell them, just be suppressed and accept things, no, I'm not telling them that.
I have a challenge to all of you then. If you want the youth to stand up and not be suppressed, what are you doing to actually lead by example, to stand up and create an example that they can follow?
Education is a key element, and as I said, starting from zero, we need to reset the mindset. The psychology is absolutely wrong, especially in the developed world, where, you know, especially those that live in the lap of luxury. We need to reset the mindset, and we need to educate and make sure that the education is inclusive of elements that are effectively sustainable for themselves, society, the economy, and the environment. I think they're key elements.
Can I
know what I'm doing. I took a flight all the way from LA to come here, to participate here, to send a very simple message to people who are listening, to our youth. You can do it. As much as I take the message back to the United States of saying to them, what we had in the Arab world and the diversity, I look at this crowd, and it's probably more diversified than any crowd I've spoken to in the United States. So we have diversity. We're here because we're trying to get things done. So what I'm doing is I come here to speak to youth about opportunities that are unlimited, and I take what I lived through for 28 years and go and talk about it in that part of the world.
Well, I mean, talking about individual challenges, I think, well, one of the people who supported Takreem and has been one of the big supporters of Takreem, Samir Khouri. Samir and Khouri and myself, we started what's called the Palestinian Education Trust. And that was after really fighting the people within the government of Palestine. And what it stands for, it's not for sending students for education, actually changing the mindset shift and really creating or allowing critical thinking to be part of the curriculum from teacher going downwards. So that is something that we're trying to do across. And why Palestine? Because it's the only place that we could do this and be allowed by the government to push the critical thinking to be #1 issue. And that's why we're doing it there. #2, on a personal basis, I've changed my strategy in life. I'm a retired person. I'm helping startups in this part of the world. I am helping as much as I can startups for them to think outside the box and try to do things. It is not only, my son is in Silicon Valley. Okay. He's coming back because he feels that this is the part of the world that he needs to develop in terms of doing things, in terms of startups. And for me, I've been told by my son that I should do that for the rest in this part of the world. So I'm doing that for the little it is, for the young, try to push them. And it is for the young startups, not for any startup. And I really believe in education is the right thing forward. I'm not going to talk about what I do or don't do for education on an individual basis for refugees or non-refugees, but I think that is one thing that you can do, but that is not the thing which is the big thing. Like the Education Trust in Palestine, hopefully if it works, it could be taken up by others in this part of the world. But these are things that we have to work. Coming back to sustainability, one of the most important pillars of sustainability is the right way of education, which is allowing critical thinking to get in the heads of people.
Well, let's hope that the future is much more positive than the past has been, and that we all can learn lessons from each other and continue to respect one another and actually display the moral courage it would take to move all of our societies forward. Thank you all for your time, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.